Hello, peace and love to all of those within our congregation and our listeners at large who are participating in our Sunday school lessons. This is Minister Leonard Harris. This is our lesson for July the 13th, 2025. It is lesson number 7 out of Unit 2, Jesus and the Temple. And the title for our lesson for this Sunday, out of our Faith Pathway Study Manual, is A Question of Authority. A Question of Authority. The devotional reading is Luke, the 13th chapter, verses 10 through 17. And our background scriptures are Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 14. Mark, the 2nd chapter, verses 23 through 28. And Luke, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 11. Our printed passage is Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 8. And our key verse for this lesson is, I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. Matthew, the 12th chapter, verse 6. Our lesson's aims are discern how Jesus' teaching and actions help us to see the limitations of rules and institutions. Assess your convictions of faith as they pertain to today's laws and social norms. Interpret and implement Jesus' guidance as it relates to expressions of religious observance in your church tradition. And we once again have 2 parts to our lesson. The first part is misunderstanding the Sabbath, and that's Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 5. And then our second part and concluding part is the Sabbath's Lord. And that's Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 6 through 8. And before we begin to indulge ourselves in our lesson, we would like to open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, the God of creation, the God of all that is, we pause in this moment just to say thank you for who you are, for what you continue to do in spite of ourselves, and for your love, kindness, mercy, provisions from generation to generation without failure. We thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that you have blessed us with, that we could study your word and receive the interpretation and understanding that you would have us to know. And we just ask your continued blessings upon all that listen and all that apply, not only hear, but apply the teachings of your word to our daily lives. And we ask it all in the name of Christ Jesus, and for his sake we ask it. Amen. So as we start into our lesson, we would like to identify and acknowledge the opposition in this lesson. I want to give a little bit of recognition to the nature or to the motive of the opposition to the mission and the work of Christ. And so in our biblical context, the sentence towards the very end kind of overlays what we are dealing with in this lesson on a question of authority. And it reads, a significant cause of conflict and opposition to Jesus by the ultra-religious Pharisees was his deliberate violation of their Sabbath traditions. Chapter 12 opens with a description of one of these confrontations regarding this issue. I want us to just pay attention here to the first part of this sentence, and it says, a significant cause and conflict of opposition to Jesus by the ultra-religious Pharisees was his deliberate violation of their Sabbath traditions. Now, when we think of what is contained in this reading in our biblical context of our lesson, I'd like to just discuss this group, the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were noted as a group of strict adherents to the Mosaic law, that they were looked upon as a religious sect of the Jewish nation, the Israelites, but they were viewed as being very staunch in their application of the Mosaic law, but many times above the Mosaic law. They gave more credence and more application to their oral traditions, and they held their own oral traditions in higher esteem many times than their application of the law of Moses. So they put more faith, or they put more conviction into the traditions that they had set themselves as a group. And speaking of the group, I find it ironic that they were named the Pharisees. The Pharisees being a derivative form of the oppression that Israel underwent in the land of Egypt under the rulership of the Pharaoh. And I find it quite strange that a staunched religious group who wanted to be recognized as those that upheld and walked the thin line of perfecting the law of Moses, the law of God, and the law of liberation and freedom from oppression, that they would affix to themselves a name that was associated with the oppressor. And when we look at their actions towards Christ and their actions and behavior towards the masses of the people of Israel, we see them operating as like a buffer group, as like a group that extended the oppression and the rulership of Pharaoh. They became the new overseers over the people, and they acted in such a way. They acted as though they were overseers of the masses, but they were not attending to the needs of the masses. And that created the conflict that Christ came to serve the people, but not to master or to be an overseer of the people, but to be a servant of the people. Now, when we look at Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 5, the story tells us that at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate?" The King James says, "profane the Sabbath, and yet are innocent." The King James says, "and are blameless." The priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless. And here, the priest, although the Sabbath was held in like high regard, in fact, in the book of Exodus, it explains that, believe it's Exodus, the 31st chapter, verses 12 through 18. It speaks very clearly about the sacredness of the Sabbath, that the Lord, even speaking to Moses in the 31st chapter of Exodus, verses 12 through 18, in those verses, God is explaining to Moses the sincere intentions of the Sabbath, the day that is to be revered as holy from generation to generation. It speaks about it is to remain a day without work but resting, a day to reflect, to meditate, to pray, and to assess who this God, this Spirit, this presence is that provides for us, that protects us, that forgives us, that loves us, that redeemed us, that restores us, that who this God is, and so that our concentration is not distracted or interfered with other responsibilities or duties. Then this is a time to withdraw from our daily occupations and our daily functions and those things that many times don't give us the time to reserve ourselves to what God, our creator and provider, is saying to us. So therefore, this day of rest was to remove us from distractions, although they may very well be needed. They may be certain responsibilities that we need to perform. But this day, it was strictly instructed that there is to be no work done on this day, that this was to be a day of rest and reflection, and anyone that was to be found working on the Sabbath was to be cut off and removed from the group, the community at large. And it was also spoken unto Moses that that person shall surely be put to death. So the Sabbath was very significant. But when we look at the verses in the first part of our lesson, there is a comparison here. For the Pharisees see this behavior of the disciples, and right away they attacked Christ on it. And they were always trying to find ways to entangle Christ in the application of the law. And by them being such a strict religious group, by them being, I should rephrase that, by them being viewed and wanting to be acknowledged as such a strict religious group, we find on occasion after occasion after occasion that they were more adherents to their own traditions than they were to the fulfillment of God's law. And this creates the contradiction, the conflict, and the disturbance between them and Christ, because Christ is the fulfillment of the law. So in verses 1 through 5, they address Christ with this question about, why are your disciples working? Why are they plucking ears of corn from the field on the Sabbath? They are not supposed to be doing any signs of any work. Why are they doing this with you and you have not addressed it? And then Christ reminds them of David. And when we look at this recall of David's actions, we see in 1 Samuel, the 21st chapter, verses 1 through 6, that David had been sent on an assignment. When you read 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6, in these verses we find that David has come into a land known as Nob, and he approaches Ahimelech the priest. And when he approaches the priest, Ahimelech, he tells that the king had ordered him on some business that he is not to reveal to anyone, but in the process of doing so, his men that are young men that were also assigned with David to accomplish this order set by the king, Saul, that they were hungry. And so he approaches the priest that they may receive bread. And the priest, in the 4th verse, let's start in the third verse. It says, "Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there is no such bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have at least kept themselves from women. Then David answered the priest and said to him, truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. So the flour that makes the bread, David is expounding upon the fact that it's common, it's natural, it's normal, even though you prayed over it and sanctified it, consecrated it for this vessel this day. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread. And the showbread was prepared by the priest and then set aside to be served on the Sabbath. And it says the showbread which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Now, when we think of the preparation of the showbread for the Sabbath, since there is the argument by the Pharisees about doing work on that day, and here David and the young men that were with him were hungry, and they therefore the showbread was only for the priests to partake of it, but the priest prepared it for those that on the Sabbath came into the temple and received the showbread. And so here the opposition here and the contrast of it is that Christ mentioned to the Pharisees, have you read or have you not read about David when he went into the temple, went and approached the priests and they gave him the showbread, which was according to the law, which was only for the priests to be eaten. But because of the issue at hand, David was given the bread by the priest for the work that David was doing for the Lord. He was assigned a task, and David, as we know, was favored by God. And so therefore, mercy was granted unto David for what he was doing. And what Christ was trying to explain and get over, which is basically the whole understanding of our lesson, is that there are human needs that take precedent over strict religious adherence. And what Christ, as will be demonstrated further in our lesson, reveals here is that mercy supersedes certain guidelines that have strict regulations. And when we pay more attention to the strict regulations, as I said before, by many of the Pharisees, these were not actually just laws. These were oral traditions that suited the practices of the Pharisees. So when we sometimes place our own rules, when we sometimes place our own restrictions that override the needs of the people that we are to serve, then we also have rendered the fullness of God's law to be negating mercy and kindness and forgiveness to those to whom it is to serve. And so when we look at this, the other thing we must realize too about the priest on the Sabbath, and this is in the Numbers, the 28th chapter. Here, as you read on up to like about the 10th verse, you will find that the priests, when we speak of no work on the Sabbath, who was working to prepare the showbread to be served to the people on the Sabbath? Somebody had to prepare the showbread. So the priests, the Levitical priesthood, they worked on the Sabbath to prepare the showbread. The priests also worked all week long because they also had daily offerings where the showbread was used. They had the weekly preparation. They had the Sabbath preparation. They had certain monthly preparations for the showbread. They also prepared the showbread on the Passover and on other feasts throughout the year. So the priests worked all the time in the course of fulfilling the laws of God. And so when we look at this, and they speak here about not being in line with the fulfillment of the restrictions on working on the Sabbath. So then Christ also gives us several references here. One of the references is in the 13th chapter of Luke, verses 15 through 16. It speaks about the woman who had the issue of bleeding for 18 years. And in the 15th through the 16th verse, Christ equates this with the care that was given to animals by the Pharisees. And he reminds them of, if your ox or your donkey is tied, don't you release them on the Sabbath so that they can be free to graze in the pasture and be free to receive water from the water trough? Don't you release them? There's also the story in the book of Matthew, again relating to how those who had strict adherences to the law, the Pharisees, he reminds them again in Matthew, this time is with the sheep. And he tells them, the 12th chapter of Matthew, verses 9 through 14, he reminds them that if a sheep has fallen into a hole, don't you rescue the sheep and remove him from the accident that occurred? You don't just leave the sheep injured or harmed in the hole that he fell into, even though it's the Sabbath. Don't you remove yourself from the guidelines of the Sabbath to save a harmed sheep who fell into a hole? So also in Mark, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 6, and also in Luke, the 6th chapter, verses 6 through 11, it tells us of the man with the withered hand. And Christ asked the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or evil? Is it lawful to save a life are to kill on the Sabbath. He reminds them that there is a higher precedent that should be observed and practiced above those guidelines that are so often practiced by the Pharisees and negating the real need of the people to whom they are to serve. And so in your time, if you read through those scriptures, and then we want to come to the last part of our lesson, verses 6 through 8, where it reads, "But I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now this really upset the Pharisees because they didn't want anyone standing toe-to-toe, face-to-face with them, telling them that I am in higher authority than you and your practices on the Lord's day. Because the Pharisees, as we have said earlier, had set themselves as though they were the actual physical lords of the Sabbath. That if you have anything that you need to ask or question about or things need to be settled, you come to us because we are the most devoted group to the law of God. And so they wanted to remain in this position of authority. They wanted their status to remain as it was. They wanted the continuation of lording over the people. And here now Christ is telling them that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. If you had acknowledged this, then I would have had mercy and not sacrifice over you. But one of the things that we want to acknowledge here is the bread, the showbread, because the showbread symbolically, it meant certain things. It had symbolic expressions to it because it identified that the God of Israel, the God of creation, was the God that provided. The provision showed forth the presence of God and also the mercy of God. In spite of the disobedience of God's people, it still represented God's faithfulness and God's provision, presence, and mercy. These things were contained in the symbolism of the representation of the showbread. And when we look at the connection between the symbolic presentations of the showbread, we want to look at the real bread of life. And that is found in the 12th chapter of John, and I would like to read that to you. I apologize. It is not the 12th chapter of John. It is the 6th chapter of John. And I'm just going to read a few of the verses to make the connection between the showbread, its symbolism, and who is the earthly physical fulfillment of what it represented. Now, this is after Jesus had fed the multitudes with the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And the people so astonished by what they experienced and participated in. They wanted to follow Christ. And so after the disbursement of the people, after being fed, the disciples had taken boats and gone ahead of Christ. And then Christ himself is now without the disciples, but they see that Christ has gotten into a boat and now gone ahead to Capernaum. And now they themselves get into the boats to follow Christ. And in the verse 25 of the 6th chapter, it says, "And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, 'Rabbi, when did you come here?' Jesus answered them and said, 'Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves of bread and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him.' And they said to him, 'What shall we do that we may work the works of God?' Because in what God disclosed to them, he mentioned to them not to labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life." So now right away, although they were drawn to the physical bread, they said, "What work shall we do that we may work the works of God?" Verse 28. And then 29, Jesus answered and said to them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent." Believe in him who God sent. And then when we come down to verse 30 and read further, it says, "Therefore they said to him, 'What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat.'" Then Jesus clears up their confusion and misunderstanding in verse 32. He says, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. From the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world.'" Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." A lot of times our recognition and our attachment is based on physical needs, based upon physical things. But Christ was trying to teach the people that I'm not the physical bread. I am the spiritual bread. I'm the bread that gives life. I'm the bread that fulfills the provisions, the presence, the mercy, and the faithfulness of God. I'm the bread that was sent from heaven in physical form to fulfill the needs of those that believe upon him which was sent from God above. And I would like to close with this. And this comes from Mark, the 2nd chapter, and the 27th verse. Again, in this dialogue here, starting at the 23rd verse of the 2nd chapter of Mark and going all the way down to the 28th. But in the 27th verse of the 2nd chapter of Mark, it reads, "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." And I would like to close with that verse and reading from Christ, that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. We hope, as always, that something was shared and said that gives understanding and gives purpose to the words of Scripture as intended by God to lift our understanding and to equip us, even in this day and time, to be lights to those that are lost and to a world that is drowning in darkness. As always, our prayer is God bless you and God keep you, is our prayer.